All right, continue with our conversations with Keith with the political slant, and we have Greg Coulson, Democrat candidate of the 78th District for Kentucky House of Representatives now. Greg and I had some great conversations over the, last 3 or 4 months.
It's been longer than that, I think.
It's February, whatever that is, however long ago that was. But, conversations where you would be traveling somewhere, and we literally talk from when you left Cynthiana to wherever you were going for 30, 40 minutes. And I love talking politics, and we've had some good conversations. So I say that because if we go long-winded a little bit, it's just because we're enjoying talking about it. So, let's talk. First off is we've started all of these by just giving you an opportunity to answer the question, who is Greg Coulson?
Greg Coulson's a guy who never expected to run for political office, honestly. I like to joke that I didn't even run for class president. So, I was out and just running my business, riding motorcycles, raising my kid. And it just got to the point over the last 2 years where I was on Facebook talking smack, disagreeing with a lot of things that were happening. And it was kind of time to either saddle up or shut up. And so I decided, after talking to my wife, that we'd go ahead and try and make the changes that we thought were necessary. So I've been an attorney for about 8 years. I worked my way through school at a factory and waiting tables. I've been married to my wife, Courtney, it'll be 10 years in January. Her parents are retired teachers from Harrison County. They taught the band over at the high school and the middle school. And I have a 4-year-old daughter who is an absolute firecracker and is hilarious and cracks me up every day, and her name's Molly. And so, we're running to try and return some of the focus in politics on these working people issues and retired people issues, and really the everyday person. We feel like it's strayed a little further in the other direction than it should.
Okay. Now, living in Harrison County, working in Harrison County, border state of Pendleton County, but you grew up in another border state, correct? You graduated from Grant County?
Williamstown High School.
Williamstown High School, okay.
And my mom still lives off of Hewens Ridge. My brother lives over there. He sells trucks and cars over at Piles Chevrolet. Or Piles GM now. It used to be Piles Chevrolet growing up, and they moved over to Dry Ridge, and that's where my family is. So if you know any Coulsons off of Kiefer Road in southern Grant County, that's those are my people.
Cool.
So,
those are my people. That's your posse.
That's right. That's right.
All right. Well, to kind of get started, one of the first questions I wanted to talk about, kind of not to set the tone of this, but the tone of politics in this country is, and it's highlighted today because we're taping this on the day that the FBI report is going to come out in Kavanaugh, which is probably just going to ramp up the tone of the politics to an even higher level, the toxic level. We've always had these points in history that we've had. You had the 70s with the Vietnam War. You had the McCarthyism and all the civil rights issues in the 50s and the 60s. We've always had these periods. So it's not unusual for us. We kind of forget about those other ones. But golly, it's such a bad toxic tone. Is there anything we can actually do to solve this toxic tone?
I think so. Okay. And so as far as how just nasty things are right now, I've talked to a couple friends. I'm 35, so I didn't live through the 70s, And so when I look back at history, were things this bad in the mid-90s? Were things this bad in the during the Nixon Watergate? Were things this bad in the 60s? And a lot of my older friends tell me, this is pretty close to on par with how angry people are. And one of the things that I've noticed is that there's not a lot of room for disagreement right now, because as soon as somebody disagrees with you, they're a bad person. And we've ramped up our policy beliefs to the point that if you disagree with me on something, then your values are wrong and you're a bad human being. And we've got to change that. And there are some things where, if you believe that crushing out poor people and favoring, the ultra wealthy, that's frustrating. But what we need to do is return to policy. We've got to stop focusing on a person.
Oh, that's good.
And so throughout this campaign, I've spent a lot of time talking about my disagreements on policy, because I'm fired up about some of the policy that has happened. But even with my opponent, he's a good guy, right? He's a firefighter, veteran, father, public servant. He's a good guy. But we just think really, really differently about policy, and I'm highly critical of the policy that was passed. So let's always return back to the laws. Let's always return back to the subject and not on the human being. November 6th is the election. November 7th, when the shooting's over and the smoke clears and there's one or two people standing, we got to wake up and live with each other. And so that's what we got to keep in mind is November 7th.
Yeah, because November 7th, 2 years ago, heck, this country didn't do that. With what you just said, we haven't done that at all. But it would be so nice in November 7th of 2018 if we could do that.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And yeah, I've never run for office before. We may win, we may lose, but we got to get to leading.
You mentioned something earlier, and I was going to follow up on that, and I forgot until you just said that. What was the tipping point? What was the last straw that broke the camel's back that you were intrigued maybe by the idea of running to, yeah, I'm running?
I didn't want to ever run, but it was the charter school and right to work bill.
Okay.
Because my grandfather worked at Ford for decades. He was a machinist mate in the Navy.
Mm-hmm.
Came out, went to work at the GE plant in Evendale, and then he worked at the Ford plants at Batavia and Sharonville. And man didn't have a college education, but he made a good living wage because that organized labor applied upward pressure to wages in his profession.
Yeah.
And so when I saw the right to work for less bill go through, it became very clear that we were taking a very anti-working people posture in the legislature and in the government. And then when you coupled that with some of the tax reform that we knew was coming, a couple of years ago, Kansas passed a really radical tax reform. You've probably looked at it. I'm across my legs here, I apologize. And what they did is they switched to this consumption-based tax focus. And it was an absolute nightmare for that state. I mean, we had schools shutting down, police and EMS coming off the streets, huge budget shortfalls. It was just an absolute disaster. The architect of that tax system is a guy named Arthur Laffer. And Arthur Laffer is the author of this idea called the Laffer curve, which is counterintuitively, as you lower tax rates, government revenues can increase to a point. Mm-hmm. And so he says, well, yeah, lower taxes, and then all these businesses will open up, and then we'll make a ton more money. And it's kind of a variation on that old trickle-down idea. And what we've seen over and over again is that doesn't actually work. And Kansas was a good example of that. Well, Arthur Laffer and a bunch of his buddies poured about $250,000 into the 2016 House races. And so following the money, we knew that tax reform was going to be coming to Kentucky.
Okay.
And so seeing that on the horizon and knowing some of the policies that had already been passed, we thought it was time to get in there and resist that and make sure that we continue to have a fair revenue system and tax system for Kentuckians.
Okay. Well, that was going to be a question I was going to ask later on, but let's go ahead and segue right into that so we're there. Now, where you're talking about lowering income taxes is not necessarily successful in Kansas. Doesn't Florida and Texas, who doesn't have income tax, and they are a more consumption-based tax system, I think, doesn't that support that if it's done correctly, that it can be? So the question I'm asking I'm going to get to, is what do you see as what should be the way Kentucky generates its revenue?
Okay, so those are really common examples of why we should do that. And we have to realize that every state is very different.
Absolutely.
And so Florida, Tennessee, which is the other example, have huge tourism industries that Kentucky doesn't have. We've got some going on, but not nearly to the level that they do. And so they generate huge amounts of revenue of tourism dollars on that consumption tax based on people spending discretionary income by going there, having a family vacation at Disney World or Universal Studios or Dollywood or the granola lottery, and doing those things. And so that there is a level of fairness in that regard, because these are discretionary, these are non-essential purchases, and so that's how they're choosing to raise revenue. Texas has oil and cattle, so they have a different way of doing things as well.
Yeah. And they have some tourism, or I would assume that they have some tourism dollars that comes in.
Yeah.
People wanting to travel to Texas and different things and visit Alamo and
Yes.
other things that's going down there. But just like your point is that those 3 states are different because every state's different.
Yes.
That same argument holds for Kansas though. That since every state's different, it doesn't necessarily mean that the failures of Kansas, the successes of Florida, Tennessee, and Texas, and the failures of Kansas will necessarily translate to Kentucky.
Except that Kentucky's economy is more similar to Kansas than those high tourism states. So Kansas and Kentucky are very agricultural states with a lot of industry driving its economy. And where those states have tourism driving their economies, we are focused on agricultural production and industrial production to the extent that we can.
Has our economy dropped based upon with the tobacco buyouts and because I know just here in Pendleton County,
Yeah.
the amount of farmers that we have that rely on agriculture for their income has dropped tremendously because simply they don't do tobacco anymore.
Yeah.
So are we seeing a transition in the Kentucky economy? I don't want to say we're totally away from agriculture because I don't think we will ever be.
No.
But has there been a decrease upon that
Yeah.
to other areas just simply because we're not the growing tobacco state? Now, if the hemp industry comes in,
Yes.
we might ramp that back up again.
So let me circle back around to this, but I'm going to answer your question. I'm going to do a terrible
Okay,
thing and
that's fine.
ask you a question.
Hey, me and you are just having a conversation like we did on the phone.
How many full-time farmers without other jobs do you know today versus how many did you know in 1979 or 1980?
I don't think it's much different for Pendleton County
Okay.
because
It's different overall.
Yeah.
There's half the number of small farmers.
because most of the farmers that I knew growing up were all part-time farmers. They had
Yeah.
jobs other places, and they used that to supplement their income. I don't want to say supplement to make the basic necessities, but was to make a big jump in their income.
Yeah.
To those kind of things. I knew a handful of farmers.
Yeah.
But most of them are still around and still farming.
Yeah.
I would say that there's not as many younger full-time farmers as possibly there used to be in the 70s when I was 70s and 80s. And it's probably a dying out breed of the ones who just are getting into that. But a lot of the ones that I knew in the 70s or 80s are still doing it.
Yes.
Or their kids are still doing it.
And that's the problem is that there are very few full-time family farms left. And the number has been cut in half since that time period of small family farms. And so farming these days is almost unprofitable unless you're doing it at a huge scale. And so one of the things that we're focusing on is transitioning to different agricultural products. You brought up hemp. We've been really, in fact, Monday before the debate, I was in my buddy Jason Marshall's barn hanging hemp, which I
Does it look like
texted him.
tobacco?
It doesn't look like tobacco, but it feels similar when you're hanging it. And I texted
Were you on the top rail or down the bottom?
he was catching, I was throwing up,
Okay.
yeah.
So you had the much cooler of the job.
I did, but my right shoulder, I texted my brother and my brother-in-law. I was like, hey, you remember how much we hated hanging tobacco? I was like, it's not much better when it's hemp, But he's got the possibility of making some real money. Now, he had some really bad flood damage this year, and until we get this farm bill through, they're not going to be able to insure their crop like you can other crops. And so,
Really?
yeah.
Okay.
You can't insure a hemp crop right now. Now, this is a nonpartisan issue. McConnell, Rand Paul, all of them are in favor of allowing the hemp decriminalization nationally. So things are going to get better soon, hopefully. But we were really worried after that bad flooding and rain that we had because he could really lose a lot this year.
And without insurance, wow, that would have been devastating.
Yeah, and this is a guy, this is his 5th year growing. He's been at the forefront of hemp in Harrison County, along with the Furnish family. I think they got something like 500 acres. our judge executive grew a bunch of hemp last year and this year, you know, and the first time I ever saw a hemp harvest was out at his farm, which was very cool. So we
What's a
definitely-
hemp harvest look for? Like I said, we're
Yeah.
going to stray sometimes because now I'm curious. Is it like you go out there and cut it like a tobacco stick, or is there
Jason
like a
did it.
cotton? Okay, that's what it is like.
This year, yeah. So this year, that's how Jason did it. Is, you know, you take your tobacco knife, which if you never have done tobacco knife actually looks like a hatchet. But you know, take your tobacco knife and you take it out, and then they had a hand haul a lot of it because it was real soft out there still from the rain, so that increased the labor side of things. Our county judge actually did it bud by bud. So we had a bunch of guys out there with pruning shears, and you're taking off the CBD containing bud and then throwing it in hoppers.
Really?
So that was interesting. So you'd get through the field, you know, you're pulling your wagon with your tractor, and you get through the field, and it's a bunch of these straight stalks sticking up, you know. So there's a couple ways to do it. Then the folks who are doing fiber hemp, so non-CBD based hemp, but hemp for clothes, concrete, whatever you're going to use it for, they will take a high boy and just cut it all straight down like they're mowing, and then that'll be processed into fiber. So there's a couple of ways to do it, and it kind of depends on what product you're trying to make with it.
Well, it sure seems like the next industry that Kentucky can get involved in, and the farmers could replace their tobacco crops if they're willing to get in there. And actually, here in Pendleton County, I don't think necessarily it would be the tobacco farmers that I know, because they're at the stage of their career that they're probably not looking to start a new farm system because they're older age.
Yeah.
But will it be the younger farmers here in Pendleton County that want to delve into that industry like the tobacco farmers did 30, 40, 50 years ago?
Yeah, I mean, how many people do we know, you know, these kids, you know, they bought their first truck because they got their, you know, first, you know, acre, 2 acre base or something, and grew some tobacco, you know, and they worked hard all summer, and, you know, that's how they did it. I'm hopeful that hemp can be a product for those young people and this next generation of farmers, so that we can maintain the agricultural nature of Kentucky, and of this district in particular. This is a very agricultural district.
And we won't stray into this because I don't want to get on my soapbox, but being a retired school teacher, my frustration is over the last couple decades, the schooling has changed to testing in college and less vocational, where we've not cultivated the next generation of farmers, because we've cut back on the FFA programs and the DECA programs and the FBLA programs and FHA or FCCLA programs and the TSA programs for the need to pass a nice little test and an ACT score.
Yeah.
And that's my frustration. That would be a soapbox that I could talk on for several hours.
I will say, yeah, I mean, we just leave this thing running. I'll see you tomorrow, you know. You know, for a long time, and I grew up in this generation, you know, I didn't grow up with a lot. And you know, we lived in a trailer park at times, and you know, there were things that were difficult. And so for a long time, a college degree was viewed as the only way to a better life. And I think that we're seeing now that there are many paths to a better life. There are many paths to a sustainable life, that you can earn a dignified income that allows you to support your family and live the American dream, that don't require 4-year degrees.
Yeah.
And so I'm very excited. I think...
or any degree.
Yeah, I mean...
Training and education past high school, yes.
Yeah, that's essential.
But an apprenticeship with an electrician, welder program, those can have great lives.
Man, I was at the Ironworkers Local 44 a couple of weeks ago, and they're taking these kids and they're putting them to work and training them so they'll get their apprenticeship, and it takes 4 years to be a journeyman. But these kids are making $20-25 an hour on the way, hanging steel and learning this stuff. That's a living wage, and that's something that you can be proud of, the hard work that you're doing, building something, and earning a wage that you can live on, you know. So I'm really excited. If you ever get a chance to go over there, it's amazing, because you go in there, think they've got like 12 or 16 welding booths. So these kids are teaching or learning stick and wire. I keep saying kids. These young workers are learning stick and wire welding. And then they've got girders set up, and it was funny. Of course, I've never hung steel in my life, and so I saw this wrench that comes down to a point at the end. I'm like, man, that looks brutal. What is that? And they're like, that's a spud wrench. I'm like, well, why is there a giant, stake on the end, and y'all killing vampires? And they're like, no.
Hey, wait a minute, you're from Harrison County. You thought vampires were zombies.
That's true. That's true.
You're the home of Walking Dead, so it's gonna be zombies.
We gotta get the
That's
headshot. Yeah. Double tap headshot. And they're like, no, you stick that in the bolt hole, and then you can use that wrench to leverage the steel to line up the bolt hole. I was like, oh, that's pretty cool.
Yeah.
So yeah, if they're
and whoever gets elected needs to carry that mindset that when you're doing testing and those kind of things, and you're passing a plan or however it would be on how to judge schools, it's not by test scores.
Yeah, and
that is as important as what a kid, for that kid that you're describing.
Yeah,
that's as a vital and as an accessible program for a school district. If that same kid goes and takes an ACT and gets a 31 on, and they're never going to college.
Yeah.
That 31 doesn't mean that kid necessarily going to be successful, but what you just described does mean that kid can be successful. Or not, at least they're equal. They're equal. Where it seems like we're putting the test score here, and those programs here, and at minimum they should be here.
Well, and you're now touching on some problems, some bigger issues, which is Greg Coulson's a lawyer, right?
Yeah.
Oh, cool lawyer, like everyone should grow up to be a lawyer. You should not be a lawyer. You will have tons of student loan debt, and you will make as much as those boys hanging steel,
Yeah.
And, but when you're talking about testing, that's really interesting because I was talking to a couple of my friends who teach over here at Pendleton County Schools, and these assessments came out, and the Pendleton County school system got a TSI rating, which is, they were not happy with. And so breaking down those numbers on why that TSI rating happened, and I'll let you do the reporting on that. It's kind of ridiculous on why they did.
I wanted to be other.
Yeah, it's kind of ridiculous why they did. And now the new Kentucky Department of Education board wants to institute a 10th grade test to do one more assessment. And we're in a balance right now where, yes, we have to have really good oversight on education because the kids in Pendleton County and Harrison County deserve the same quality education as a kid living in Louisville or Lexington or Northern Kentucky, okay? So you've got to balance accountability with the fact that we're just teaching or forcing teachers to teach to tests, and we're setting evaluations for them, but then we're not offering any resources to make things better. And so what good does it do to say, you're not doing a good job, we're not going to do anything about it? Yeah. And so that's very frustrating to them and to me. So.
And I didn't mean to stray in that. Didn't even have a question on it.
No, we'll go down
but my 2 cents, and then we'll transition to another one, is solving education problems is very, 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 very simple.
Oh yeah.
That nobody will ever do. You take an elementary teacher and you make that student-teacher ratio somewhere around 8 to 10 instead of the 24 that they have now. You take a middle school teacher and they don't have more than 12 kids. You take a high school teacher and they don't have more than 16 kids. Them kids are going to learn at an astronomical level because the teacher gets ready to work with more. Get rid of all your tests, all your PD, all your other stuff that all the politicians are trying to solve, and give an elementary teacher 8 kids in that classroom. That kid's going to learn to do things they can work on. It's very expensive to do that.
I was about to say.
And nobody will ever do that, but that's the way. Let the teachers teach with a small number of kids, and they'll learn.
Well, and you ran a great article the other week about Pendleton County's current economic climate and how things are going there. And one of the things that was pointed out was the disparity in education funding in Kentucky, where they wanted us to spend what was another $1,000 a year per kid. That comes at a cost. And so the next few years in the legislature, we're going to have to make some really difficult priority decisions are we going to double down and invest in training and education in order to get us ready for this next century of workforce? Or are we going to continue trying to cut our way to greatness, you know? And some hard decisions are going to have to be made.
Well, about 2 days ago, I asked you a question
Yes.
about where you think Kentucky revenue is supposed to come from,
Yes.
and I moved us away from that question.
Sorry, yeah.
So let's circle back to that question.
Okay.
As you see it, whether it's income, consumption based, whatever,
Yeah.
where do you see the way Kentucky's system should be set up to generate revenue?
Okay. I will always be in favor of a revenue generation system that focuses on income and profit rather than consumption. And there are a few reasons for it. The first is that we can do things in a much more calculated and orderly fashion if we're doing personal and corporate taxes based on income and profits. Okay, we can look and take a snapshot of a family or a corporation, find out what their revenue is, how much they're making, what their liabilities are, what things they're paying for, and then calculate a tax system that doesn't break them and that still provides the revenue necessary for the essential services that we've built as a society. Pardon me, my allergies are crazy, spring and fall. And we can also incentivize things more effectively by doing that. If we want a company to invest in a certain sector or in building capital or something like that, we can incentivize that. We already incentivize families by providing mortgage deductions and those things. Up until this legislative session, we excluded from income money that families spent on health care. And that was really important to me because I run a small business, my wife runs a small business. Our insurance premiums are $800 a month for health insurance, plus any co-pays and deductibles and that sort of thing. So that's $10,000 a year in healthcare costs that I wasn't taxed on before, that I am taxed on now. Okay, when you shift to a consumption-based system of creating revenue, what you're doing is at the point of sale for any product or service that's covered, you're imposing that tax with a blind eye to that corporation or that individual or that business's situation. And so, wearing my buddy's hat right now, the Marshall Tractor Parts there in Cynthiana, we work very hard to make sure that we create as friendly an environment for farmers as possible. I mean, baling twine and fuel tax, we exclude farmers from all of that. But when they impose this tax on mechanical services, now my farmers are having to pay a tax on having their tractors worked on or having their farm trucks worked on. And so what you do is you impose a tax that targets groups that we're trying to sustain. And at the same time, it unfairly targets people who are making a very small amount of money while benefiting people and organizations that are making very large amounts of money. I gave this example at the Tea Party debate the other night, and I'll use it because I think it's helpful. If you take a family making $30,000 a year, and you take a family making $100,000 a year, okay? They're both going to have to buy sneakers for their kid for the new school year, whatever the new school supplies are, okay? And they say they buy the same pair of sneakers. Well, they're each going to pay the same number of dollars in tax, right? But my family making $30,000 a year is paying a much higher rate of their income. They're paying a much higher percentage of their income in that tax than the family making $100,000 a year, okay? Pendleton County has a median household income of $38,000 a year. And so what we see is these consumption taxes really unfairly target our everyday folks, our working folks, these bread and butter people that comprise the vast majority of our community, while favoring people who are in the 90th and 95th percentiles of income earners in Kentucky.
All right, let me ask you a question on that scenario, because right
Yes.
at my desk yesterday, I had somebody who had watched our video of the debate, falmouthOutlook.com, you'll see the debate from the Tea Party Monday night, little plug.
Yeah.
But you can go on there and watch the whole debate. He watched the debate,
Uh-huh.
and he had a comment on that example.
Okay.
His point on the example that he did not think it was a good example
Okay.
was because that family of 30,000 may go to Walmart and buy a $40 pair of shoe.
Uh-huh.
The $100,000 family is going to buy a 200 pair of Jordans, or going to buy a much more expensive shoe. So they're not going to buy the $40 pair of shoe.
Mm-hmm.
So they're going to end up paying more taxes because they're going to go buy, or they might buy 2 or 3 pairs of shoe. Where me, I go buy 1 pair of shoe and it lasts me 8 months, and that's all I'm going to do.
Yeah.
Where I know people who have more income than me that will buy 2, 3, 4, 5 pairs of shoes.
Mm-hmm.
So they would be paying more than I would have been as a teacher, because I just simply don't buy a lot of shoes.
It's a good point, and it's a fair point. The problem is that if you look at the macroeconomic scale, it doesn't bear out that way, because that family that's making $100,000 is not spending that whole $100,000. A lot of that money is going into savings and investment. Okay, and so when you have 2 families, their fixed necessity costs are very similar. Now, your family making $100,000 is going to have a little higher mortgage payment. They may have a little higher car payment, that sort of thing.
And they're going to buy boats. They're going to buy
Yeah.
things that, in theory, the consumption-based theory is saying they're going to be spending more to buy those kind of things, vacations, that kind of stuff.
But those are discretionary, and
Yeah.
they're and when you look at it on an economy-wide scale, the fixed cost of living is very similar for both of those families, and the only difference is that marginal rate. Okay, that they're going to spend a little bit more on those things. And so, yes, a person who makes $100,000 is going to spend more, right? And they're going to pay taxes on those things. But those things are both discretionary and similar in the things that aren't discretionary are similar to what your family making $38,000 a year is.
Let me ask you a question, and I have no clue what the answer to this is.
Yeah.
I know today with sales tax, the things that are basic necessities, food, that kind of stuff, you don't pay sales tax on. So in a consumption-based theory, are those basic necessities of milk, bread, food, whatever it may be, whatever the legislatures would determine it is, would not be charged a tax on the consumption base? So those basic necessities of life that we would all have won't come into play because there is no sales tax, or there's no tax on this. Is it still called a sales tax?
Food and medicine are not taxed right now.
That's why I'm saying, even in a consumption based, if we went away from
Yeah.
income tax to consumption, are they still, those items would not be taxed in any way, shape, or form?
We would hope so. I mean,
That's
they
what-
talked
yeah.
they talked about, taxing medicine. I think they backed away from it at some point,
Yeah.
thankfully. But how much of the budget is food and medicine? And it's very small. We need lots of different things in order to go through our daily lives.
Yeah.
And so when you do your taxes based on buying a pair of jeans or these other necessities through life, you're really focusing your revenue generation on the backs of core working people rather than on society as a whole, as far as percentage of income goes.
Okay.
And so it's a fundamentally unfair way to do it. I know I've spent a lot of time on that side of it.
No, this is very, very important.
Yeah.
Yeah,
The
and it
second-
might, and honestly, it may be where what income tax reform in the state of Kentucky may be the most important issue that is in this election and coming up in the next general session and the general sessions, because it is a very important issue. Let me ask you a quick question on your income tax. You had talked about profits and income tax. Are you progressive or tax rate? Are you a flat tax rate? Where do you fall in that regard?
I struggle with that, and let me loop back around and then come back to that. Okay?
That's fine.
The second reason that I have a problem with it is because when you tax something, you heard it, right?
When you say you have a problem with it, you're talking
The
consumption tax?
consumption tax.
Okay,
Yeah,
all
I'm
right.
sorry. I'm
Yeah,
sorry.
no, that's okay. I
When-
just want to be clear.
When you tax something, you can harm that
Yes,
activity, right?
Well, and that's where sin taxes come from.
Right.
We don't want to outlaw necessarily tobacco, smoking, alcohol. So the local governments or state governments put a higher tax on, well, New York City, I guess, is the best example recently,
gosh.
where, what was it, the mayor up there, I forget his name, wanted to put an unbelievable amount of tax on soda
Yeah.
so that the people would quit drinking soft drinks, so because he felt it was a help. So that's kind of what you're talking upon, what governments can do. You tax it, you try to get people to quit doing it.
Right. And so when you tax consumption rather than income, and at the levels that we're talking about, the 5.8, and 6% rate, people aren't going to stop going to try and earn money. Okay,
Yeah.
people are going to try and earn money, and if the tax rate's between that 5, 6, 7% rate, they're not going to just throw their hands up and say, I live in a totalitarian state and I give up. But when you tax consumption, you discourage people from buying things. And in an economy where we're really trying to help local businesses and small businesses and that sort of thing, we want to incentivize commerce as much as possible. And so anything that we can do to lower the barriers of exchange of money and goods, I think that we should do. And so that's another concern that I have about consumption. Looping back then to your other question, what was your other question?
Progressive tax rate, flat tax rate. And
I
here-
struggle
here's-
so hard with that.
Well, and I
Yeah.
think we've talked about this, and here's my frustration with a progressive tax rate,
Yeah,
and why I am leaning towards flat tax.
yeah,
You raise taxes on the wealthy, and I've said this 1,000 times, the only people that get rich off of a progressive tax rate is tax lawyers or tax accountants.
yeah,
Because the wealthy then gives them money and says, find me a loophole
Yeah.
to get out of it.
yeah,
And so they're not paying a 30, 35, 40% tax rate. They find all the loopholes,
yeah,
and they're paying 10, 12. What's the famous example? Warren Buffett has found out so many tax loopholes. He has gotten his tax rate down below his secretary's because he pays people to pay him off. And that's kind of why I've led to think it's a flat tax. Yeah, you don't have loopholes, but the rich people can't find a way out.
So yeah, I struggle really just a ton with that because there are days where I'm sitting there thinking about it. I'm like, all right, 5% of total revenue. Who cares what your deductions are? Let's be done. I don't think at the end of the day that's an effective way to do things.
The flat tax.
I don't. I think that at least not one that doesn't contemplate some deductions and some tax incentives. Because we have to understand that there is a role for government in helping to create industry, or at least make things a little bit easier for industry and commerce to happen. And so I think that if you take a corporation or a small business and impose a 5% flat tax on all of their revenue, and it doesn't matter how things happen for them that year, you're going to end up hurting some businesses in a big way. You're going to have businesses that didn't turn a profit that year. You're going to have businesses, say one of my local factories here wants to build a $10 million new manufacturing area, okay? So this year they may have $20 million in revenue, but they spent $10 million on creating a new factory, and then they spent $8 million on payroll and other overhead, and had $2 million in profit, okay? Should they really be getting taxed on $20 million when they've had that big capital investment in the community, and they've had that overhead and paying people in this community and employing them? Should they really have that huge overhead? And I don't think so. I think that would be detrimental to business. And so you say, okay, well, we'll allow it to be only on taxable income. Well, then what do we call taxable income? How do we treat a $10 million capital investment? How do we treat the investment in a pension system or the investment in a 401k for their employees? And so I don't think the right answer is to just throw our hands up and say this is too hard. I think the answer is that we continue doing the hard work and trying to make as fair and business-friendly system as possible, and allowing the legislature to look at these issues and hear from the people in the community and in the business community and find out what works best. So, and it's going to be an ongoing system, and hopefully in government you make things better every year instead of worse. So,
Isn't that the frustration that you hear a lot, that businesses, when you're talking about these business type of things, that businesses are getting all of these breaks, that you hear frustration, and talking about people, what is it they call it? The corporate welfare. I guess that's the term that's bandied about a lot. Is that's a form of corporate welfare?
It's so
and
different.
It's a hard issue. I'll agree with you.
It's so different on the state versus the federal level.
Okay.
And so I'm going to deal with the state level.
Absolutely.
At the state level, we have got to be incentivizing small business. Okay.
Define small business.
You know, some people would call it less than 25. Some people would call it less than 100
employees.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
So a small business in your mind is based upon the number of employees, not necessarily the income that is being brought in by that business.
Yeah, because you don't want to discriminate against a locally started small business, low number or medium number of employees who may not be in a high profit industry, but who nonetheless are employing a lot of folks here. And if our singular focus is going to be jobs, 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 and then good paying jobs, then I don't think that doing it by a revenue cap or revenue definition is a good way to approach that.
Yeah.
But so when we saw this tax reform happen this last session, what we saw was the removal of several benefits that helped guys like me. I'm a two-man shop, right? I don't even have a full-time secretary. And where there were several new taxes that we were going to have to start paying, or several deductions that we lost. When you're operating on the kind of margins that I am as a small business owner, and that many of my other small businesses are, that makes a big difference. And so you don't want to say, oh, I'm going to fight Walmart, I'm going to fight the man. But at the same time, if you have a large organization that's coming in, paying wages that are lower than they are necessary to sustain a family, and then taking the profits from a community and shipping them out of state, what contribution are they having to the local economy? And Walmart's significant. They employ a lot of people. They provide a very important infrastructure service. People don't shop at the IGA anymore. Here you all still have Ken's and Wyatt's, and but for the most part, when there's a Walmart in town, people go to Walmart. And so we need to be looking at a tax structure that allows us to ensure that either people earn a living wage, or that when the taxpayer has to step in and subsidize that lack of a living wage, that the taxpayer is being reimbursed for that. Because it's not right that a taxpayer who goes out and works hard has to pay a higher income tax in order to subsidize the living cost of another person who's working full-time hours but can't get by. Because I'll tell you, $8, $9, $10 an hour, that's a tough way to live.
Yeah.
That is a tough way to live.
Well, and I have two things you talked about that I want to touch upon, but I'll hit upon that one real quick. I don't think anybody's frustration is with the person that they're working hard and trying to struggle and get.
Yeah.
I think the person's frustration is, and again going back to my education basis, the person who is blown off education.
Yeah.
They don't work hard for themselves. They don't want to go get training, but they expect you to give them a living wage of $15 an hour when they've done nothing to invest in themselves, to get themselves in a position to succeed. I think that's where the frustration lies. Somebody out here that's working 40 hours a week and busting their butt, I think everybody wants to support them.
Yeah.
But swept up into supporting them are the ones who don't want to help themselves, and they want you to just give it to them.
Listen,
How do you balance that out?
there have been slackers and wastoids since the beginning of time.
Wastoids, I like that.
Yeah, my friend Alex gave me that. I'll have to. Fortunately, that percentage of people is very low. But we do see them, and they are frustrating. We have very strict rules in place where if you, say, lie to get food stamps and you get more than $100 worth of, that EBT or something like that, that's a felony. So we take very seriously the integrity of that benefit system, of that social safety net, okay? You talked about the $15 an hour minimum wage. That's not something you can do overnight. You can't just come out one day and pronounce all wages will be $15 an hour. As a small business owner, I can't hire someone right now. I definitely can't hire somebody at $15 an hour plus the 7.5% that I'm going to have to pay on their FICA and Social Security, plus workman's comp, plus all those things, you know. And so what you have to do is you have to take a more nuanced and long-term approach in applying upward pressure on working people's wages. And you do that a couple of ways. You provide a tax environment that rewards work. You provide a system where employers who provide a living wage to those individuals benefit themselves. And you and I talked about this on the phone one day, where maybe you craft a tax environment where larger businesses actually get to earn that reduction in income tax by paying a living wage to their employees. Because if you're paying someone $15, $18, $20 an hour, then you are causing less strain on the Kentucky budget. You're doing a huge thing for us because you're taking a human being, you're giving them work to do, you're giving them a way to support themselves, and you're taking one person out of a pool of people who may need to be supported by the taxpayer. And so that's something that I've really been interested in, is looking at saying, okay, if you're a large organization and you have this percentage of individuals who are making 150% of the federal poverty level, or some meaningful cutoff, some meaningful metric, then we will cut your rate. And the only thing, the other side of that though, is you have to be very careful how you do that, because once again, small business, local business, small business. My shops in downtown Falmouth and Cynthiana and Georgetown, if they can't afford to pay someone $15 or $18 an hour, I don't want to take it out on them. I don't want to grind them out of the economy and accidentally create a tax system that kills small business while favoring large out-of-state based businesses.
And I think we saw a report come out of Seattle who made that requirement of $15, and it did just that. It drove businesses out and hurt the economy, where businesses were cutting back hours because they have a set amount on personnel that they can spend, and so they had to cut back hours to stay at that amount in that regard. For those who say corporate welfare, for lack of a better term, is not good, I don't think live in reality and remember Toyota. Because nobody can make the case that Toyota has not been beneficial to the state of Kentucky. And Martha Lane Collins, Democrat governor, set up a program to encourage Toyota to come here, and it has been such a positive for Central Kentucky and Kentucky as a whole.
It's about balance, Keith, and I will tell you something that I've said before. There's not a good idea out there that fits on a bumper sticker. You cannot run an economy with a bumper sticker slogan. Because look at Toyota. That company was started because people invested in it and wanted to start a business, and that business creates tons of vehicles, and that helps the economy, and it creates tons of jobs, and it's done amazing things for Central Kentucky. And so those people who invested in it deserve to earn something from their investment. At the same time, human beings are not batteries to be exploited. And if you are going to work in industry and help build something, then you deserve fair compensation for what you're doing. And so and that's one of the reasons I'm running, is I feel like the balance has shifted too far in one direction. And when I look at Kentucky, we're growing jobs, but we have twice the national average of minimum wage jobs. It tells me that there is a group of people, and it's our bread and butter everyday folks, who aren't getting the necessities. And so I want to make sure that we're always in balance, that we're business friendly, that we create investment, that we're starting businesses and creating jobs, And the folks who are working those jobs are able to sustain themselves and support themselves and live lives of dignity, rather than work 40 hours a week and then still need housing assistance and that sort of thing.
I would add yes on that, and I would add employee balance, because here in Pendleton County, we have businesses, factories who cannot get enough employees because they hire somebody, they don't show up on time, they miss, they can't pass a drug test,
Yeah.
and they're not dependable, and they get let go.
Yeah.
That there's people there to hire, there's people there to give them a good job that's not an $8, $9, $10 an hour job, but they don't show up for work. They don't, and so they get let go. And then we have factories presently in this county now. They're
Yeah.
not trained for a job, and they can't keep workers with those soft skills. You constantly hear the economic developers in this county are talking about the factories and businesses in the county complaining they can't get workers, even though there's people out there to hire.
Yeah.
Because the employees are not doing their parts in some regards. So I agree with you on your balance there, but the employees got to do their part of it too, or let me rephrase that. The residents have to do their part of it to get educated and trained and do those things that they need to do to keep those jobs.
I'm sure that's the case in some situations, but in Pendleton County, many of our people are going out of county in order to work.
Oh, that's always been like that.
Right.
I mean,
And
my
so why
parents-
are they going out of county to work if there are these great jobs here that are available? And so we have to look at, are these jobs either available to their skill level, or are those jobs able to pay a competitive wage to where they're traveling to, so that the commute plus what they're making there is competitive and apples to apples.
My parents worked in Newport, in greater Cincinnati area from the 60s till
Yeah.
they retired in the 90s. I mean,
My granddad drove
yeah.
from Williamstown to, where it's closer to Dry Ridge, from Williamstown to Sharonville and Batavia.
Yeah, and there's sometimes that you can't replicate what is available up there. I mean, there's a lot of Pendleton County people that drove to GE.
Yeah.
Well, we can't replicate a GE factory here in Pendleton County. That's just not realistic. So, you know, there are times that you want to do that and you want to support local, and then there's times you have to be realistic and say, hey, you know, we can't
Right.
we can't compete against GE.
I can tell you that looking at the unemployment rate here, looking at the median income here, and looking at what every resident tells me, and looking at what the